Hi, this is Ilari from On Humans, and I want to start with an apology. Apology to everyone who has perhaps been staring at an empty feed in 2026. This has been a remarkably slow start to the year. A big reason for that is that there is something big launching very soon. Stay tuned for an announcement next week. But whilst waiting, I thought that I might share one of my all-time favorite episodes from the archives. An episode that I was actually reminded of recently when I tried to convince one of my favorite historians to come on the show. And she was busy writing her book, and so it seems like this is not going to happen, at least not this year. But then she said, you know what? I listened to an old episode of yours from the archives, and it was very good. I'm convinced. Let's do this. And this is the episode. This is about bipedalism, about our upright posture, about how humans stand on two legs with our head pointing into the sky. It's a topic that I have mentioned many times recently, and it's a topic that I think none of those mentions have really done full justice to. Jeremy DeSilva does full justice to it. So let's hear from him. This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. Now, humans are a pretty weird primate. We are, of course, smart and big-brained and all that, but we're also an incredibly helpless and fragile species. If you try to drop me alone in the wild, I will be gone in a couple of days, probably. And while my particular level of helplessness is partially a product of being a knowledge worker in the 21st century, the issue does go much deeper, because even the most skilled hunter-gatherers do not typically survive in most habitats without tools, clothes, and companions. Even their teeth are miserably small compared to other primates, and even they require help in childbirth. Now, indeed, while the human condition is in kind of constant flux across time and space, there are some things that we carry with us wherever we go. And our fragility is one of them. And with that fragility comes our dependence on technology such as clothes and tools, and also community. So why is that? My guest today is Jeremy DeSilva, and he thinks that the key to many of these issues lies in our posture. DeSilva is a fossil expert and the author of First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human. Looking at the fossil evidence, DeSilva thinks that our upright posture is kind of a key window into the origins of the human condition. And he's not alone in this. Already Darwin speculated that upright posture evolved to free our hands for tool use, which then allowed our teeth to shrink, demanded our brain to grow, and therefore making bipedalism a kind of kickstarter in human evolution. Now with DeSilva, we start by talking about Darwin's theory, what Darwin got right, what Darwin got wrong. And in this part, we also offer a kind of quick crash course into 7 million years of human evolution more generally. But we do soon move into discussing more recent understanding of the very specific ways in which walking on two legs might have set the stage for much more than just tool use, from our helplessness and fragility to our language and even our friendships. And while much of this conversation is about understanding our origins, I was delighted to end with some practical thoughts about how appreciation of the simple pleasures of walking can help us live better. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. If you do, I do want to remind that running the On Humans podcast requires a lot of time and resources. Now, if you are someone who has just discovered this episode, please sit back and enjoy. But if you are a regular listener and you appreciate the work, please do consider supporting the show financially. You can do so now at patreon.com. You will find a link to it in the episode description too. But let's leave the practicalities aside, as my most important desire is that you can learn something from and especially enjoy this conversation with Jeremy DeSilva. Professor Jeremy DeSilva, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ilari. I'm really pleased to be here.
So Darwin famously noted that humans are a very odd primate, pretty smart, as shown by our use of tools and our big brains. But also compared to other primates, we have very small teeth, especially small canine teeth. And we are not only the only primate, but the only mammal who walks upright. And Darwin also speculated that these are not individual things that happen separately, but they were somehow linked in our evolution. Now, I happen to know that you don't agree with Darwin about every detail on how exactly that happened, but would you still say that you're kind of still in that same tradition of seeing how all sorts of seemingly unrelated things link together in human evolution, especially how many things link to our upright posture?
Yeah, it's a great way to start. Absolutely. I mean, Darwin could only work with the evidence that he had at his time. And in 1871, when he wrote Descent of Man, we didn't have much of a fossil record at all. There were a few Neanderthal fossils that were still being debated about what they actually were, whether they were ancient humans or not. but we didn't have any fossils of earlier members of our genus. And so Darwin was really working in the dark, and he was able to look at animals living today, humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and to say, okay, what is different about us compared to them? And he noticed the exact things that you pointed out, our small canine teeth, our bipedal locomotion, our large brains, our reliance on tools and technology. And he saw them evolving as a suite of features that would have linked together. Um, we now know through the fossil record, because we now have thousands of fossils, that these things didn't evolve in lockstep the way Darwin hypothesized. Instead, it appears as though upright walking, moving on two legs, was one of the earliest evolutionary innovations in our lineage. Reduced canines also seems to go pretty far back, but large brains and tool use, at least stone tool use, happens much later. And this is why I'm so excited about upright walking. It's the thing that happens first. It's the earliest of our evolutionary innovations. And because of that, to me, it lays the foundation for everything that comes next. That without upright walking, I don't think we'd be here in the way we are today.
Quickly, what was Darwin's theory about this kind of interlocked togetherness of the evolution of all of these traits?
Right. So he also speculated that humans were the only meat eating of the apes. We now know that that's not the case. He could only make observations of zoo apes, orangutan in particular, but he knew of folks that had seen gorillas or chimpanzees in zoos. And in zoos, they didn't eat meat because no one gave it to them, right? Now, gorillas don't eat meat, but chimpanzees certainly do in the wild. So Darwin had, the information at the time was he thought that humans were the only meat-eating primate. He saw us using stone tools, and canine reduction to him may have happened in concert with tool use, so especially to process meat. If you can use tools, or those who can use tools most efficiently are going to be the ones that have freed their hands because they're moving on two legs. And so all of this to Darwin was wrapped up together in diet, tool use, the freeing of the hands, the reduction of the canines because of tools instead of teeth to process our food, especially our meat, and that all that new fuel leads to brain enlargement.
That's interesting because I would have intuitively thought that a meat eater would have to have bigger canine, not smaller canine than a vegetarian.
Unless you're using tools to do it.
Aha. Okay.
Right. So that's the link there, is that by processing meat with these tools, because Darwin certainly would have observed gorillas with their enormous canines, and they don't eat meat, and at the time he didn't think so either, and he was right about that. That gorillas are vegetarians, and so canine size is about more than just meat eating. And so today, as we think about canine reduction in the human lineage, it's linked. It could be linked to diet. If you have interlocking canines, you can't grind your food as much, and so if you're eating any food that requires grinding, then those large canines could disadvantage you. And then another group of researchers has hypothesized that this is about social interactions. And reduced canines is telling us more about pair bonding behavior in our ancestors rather than the kind of male-male aggression that you see in these large canine primates like gorillas.
Okay, so in the gorillas, the male would fight over female gorillas using canines as weapons. But what about female gorillas? Do they have big canines?
They do, certainly bigger than ours, but not large compared to the males.
Okay.
And so that kind of difference between the males and the females, what we would call dimorphism, is quite exaggerated with body size and with canine size across primates. And it matches reasonably well with their mating strategies and their social systems.
And so pair bonding, or I guess to use less jargon, romantic love, going one way or another, would fit the picture of human teeth of us not being a species that's evolved to use our teeth to fight the other males to males, like in gorillas. Is that's the theory? What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's probably more complicated than that. Humans are humans are complicated, and across the world we have all sorts of different ways that we that manifest sort of our romantic love for one another or our social systems and our mating strategies. And so I don't think it's that simple. And I don't think it was that simple throughout our evolutionary history either. Otherwise, we'd have this figured out by now. And we don't. There's still quite a bit of debate about why canines reduced early in our evolutionary history, but it does seem to coincide, or at least it happens in the roughly the ballpark timeline of the beginnings of bipedalism.
And that would be when?
About 7 million years ago, at least. Now, again, this is pretty debated because if we could go back in time to, 3 million, 4 million, we have really good fossils like the famous skeleton Lucy. She's a little over 3 million years old. At about 3.5 million years, we have fossilized footprints at an extraordinary site in Tanzania called Laetoli. So we have very good evidence that our ancestors at that time, 3.5, 4 million years ago, were moving around their world on two legs, a lot like we do. Now, they probably still climb trees at night to get away from predators. They didn't have controlled fire yet or buildings that they could go into. They didn't have construction. And they, we can talk about this later, but moving on two legs makes us actually quite slow compared to other animals and therefore very vulnerable. So to protect yourself at night, moving into trees seems like a reasonable thing to do. And this group we call Australopithecus had some of the adaptations for tree climbing, longer arms, more curved fingers, for instance. Now, if we go back further than that in time, 5 million, 6 million, 7 million.
And just for listeners, isn't 6 a kind of best guess that we have of when we last shared common ancestors with chimpanzees and bonobos?
That's right. 6 to 7 million years.
Because I know these millions of years, they can easily become just numbers that don't mean much.
Right.
So if we put some kind of rough, so around 6 million years ago, we start diverge the human lineage from the chimpanzee bonobo lineage.
That's right.
Around 3 million years ago, we have the Australopithecus, like Lucy's skeleton, for example, which give us very good evidence of this upright, walking, almost human kind of species. And then when do we start having actual species of Homo, like Homo habilis, Homo erectus? Is that like 2 million years ago? Or?
So it's about 2 million years, although some recent finds are beginning to push that back farther. 2.5 million, and there's a lower jaw from Ethiopia that's 2.8 million. That researchers suggest is from our genus, from genus Homo.
Okay, so very close to Lucy, not quite there, but
yeah. So it's really interesting. Again, this is one of these windows in our evolutionary history that's kind of foggy for the moment. We're trying to figure out more, but it's likely that the genus Homo originated evolved sometime between 2 and 3 million years ago.
Now that we're still on the timeline, what about Homo sapiens?
So Homo sapiens looks like it's about 250,000 years ago.
250,000 here.
Or maybe a tad older than that, 300,000.
Okay.
And what we're finding is that with Homo sapiens is that the oldest fossils we have from Homo sapiens are in sites throughout Africa, not in one place, but throughout. So we have fossils in Morocco, Ethiopia, and South Africa. So it looks like both from the fossil record and from our colleagues in molecular anthropology, so genetic evidence, DNA evidence, that the evolution of our own species was this pan-African event as beneficial genes spread across the continent, as neighbors mated with neighbors, and this new species evolved gradually. It wasn't one place, one time, which some of the models proposed years ago, but now we think it was, again, it always ends up being more complicated than some of our models would have predicted. So for your listeners, Homo sapiens is 250,000 years ago. The earliest Homo is 2 to 3 million years ago. Australopithecus, the predecessors, 3 to 4 million years ago. And then before that is this time period that's fascinating, but we don't have many fossils at all.
This is the foggy first half of the way to humans.
Exactly. And the fossils we do have, though, a few leg bones here and there, they indicate that our ancestors at that time were at least beginning to experiment with upright walking. They weren't doing it exactly like we do, probably much more reliant on the trees. But when they came down to the ground, they were moving on their two legs. There's no hint in many of these fossils, although I should qualify that. There's some debate about a species called Sahelanthropus, but there's little evidence for the others. that they could move on their knuckles like a chimpanzee does.
And so we actually don't even know whether our common ancestor with chimpanzees was anything like a chimpanzee. It might have been, as far as we know, more like us in terms of its walking, and the chimpanzee who diverged from.
It's really interesting. If you look at if you Google image human evolution, you'll see that classic chimpanzee turning into the human, right?
Yeah.
And you see this on coffee cups and bumper stickers, and it's been satirized, and it's one of those images that we all recognize, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a scientist, it's one of those images that I kind of chuckle at, but I don't think the evidence actually fits it well at all. That's probably not how human evolution unfolded. It wasn't so linear, it wasn't so gradual. And there's some indication, though this is quite contentious in our science right now, we're all kind of arguing about it because we don't have enough data to really test this idea yet, from the fossils at least. There's some indication that that common ancestor that we shared with the chimpanzee didn't walk on its knuckles at all, and that knuckle walking is a more recent evolutionary innovation, and that common ancestor may have been more upright, not necessarily on the ground, but upright in the trees, like gibbons and orangutans. So the Asian apes move in this way. And so if that's the case, if that's how evolution unfolded, then bipedalism, upright walking, wouldn't have been a brand new locomotion. It would be a modified locomotion from something our ancestors were already doing in the trees, just in a new environment now, which would be down on the ground. And it would help. We've struggled as a science for 150 years to figure out why bipedalism evolved. Why was it so beneficial to our ancestors? And we have used chimpanzees as a model for testing some of our ideas. Um, and those ideas have kind of fallen apart. And so some researchers now are saying, well, maybe the problem is that the model is wrong. Maybe the problem is that we shouldn't assume that the common ancestor was a knuckle walker.
This is one where the point should go to Darwin, right? Because he warned explicitly against thinking that if we share a common ancestor with chimps or monkeys or whatever, that's what the common ancestor looked like, a monkey or a chimpanzee.
Right? Darwin just had some extraordinary insight. I know that's not news to anyone, but yes, that line that he has in Descent of Man, that the common ancestor, there was no reason to think that the common ancestor would resemble any living monkey or ape. And yet, as researchers, we do that sometimes, especially if we have gaps in the fossil record. We fill them in with the living taxa as though the living taxa haven't changed. And look, it's a testable proposition, right? Maybe the common ancestor was very chimpanzee-like, and they haven't changed very much in 6 or 7 million years. That takes fossils. And we don't have a fossil record for chimpanzees much at all. There are a couple of teeth from Kenya and a possible leg bone from Uganda. And that's it. So the chimpanzee fossil record is very, very, very thin.
Yeah. Well, is it fair to paraphrase then that the whole question of why are we upright walkers and when did we start being upright walkers is really clouded in mist because of the lack of appropriate fossils, but we do know that there were small-brained upright walkers, and so it didn't quite evolve with the brain.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair, that we have enough fossils to say that the brain increased later in our evolutionary history. Roughly 2 million years ago, you start to see the enlargement of the brain.
But hold on, Lucy's brain is not big when we look at her, but her brain is big compared to a chimpanzee, right?
Okay, it is. That's fair, and I that's one of the things that it's a pet peeve of mine, and I just made the mistake myself. You are absolutely right that brain size in chimpanzees and relative brain size in gorillas is quite similar to the brain size of the earliest hominins, Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus. So 4, 5, 6 million years ago, brains don't seem to have changed. And then, yes, you're absolutely right that around Lucy's time, around 3.5 million years ago, you get a 20% increase in brain size.
Yeah, 20 is a lot.
But 20 is a lot, exactly. So that I think has to tell us a little bit about a change of the diet, a change in resources, a change in how they're acquiring food, how they're getting energy from their environment. And to me, that coincides with efficient bipedal travel across a landscape where they can gather food in their arms and their hands. And that bipedalism then is linked to dietary diversity and the ability to get this kind of energy that's going to fuel, yes, a slight increase in brain size, but 20%, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that we begin to see stone tools around that same time. And so the ability to access more resources from the environment using technology, and it becomes a feedback loop at that point. But the brains don't skyrocket at that point. They jump by 20% and then they stabilize. They stabilize for about a million years. So it's as though brain increase is happening in these stages, that the first is an energy release and a reliance on technology that happens with Australopithecus. And then that next increase happens with genus Homo, again, long after.
And that's according to at least Richard Wrangham, the second big increase would be because of fire, of being able to cook food and therefore get much more calories
That's right.
in a digestible way, right? Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Well, now then to play one more time Darwin's advocate.
I'm happy to do that.
Looking at Lucy, isn't there still then a small chance that he was almost right if we don't find many bipedal, if we don't find good evidence of bipedalism or of at least kind of day-to-day walkers? You know, maybe hominids who were able to walk but didn't do it day to day.
Yeah.
And then we do find around 3 million years ago Lucy and her mates who are upright walkers, seem to be doing it all the time, do have some stone tools, do have this, from their point of view, probably a dramatic 20% brain size increase.
That's right.
Isn't that sounds quite a lot like what Darwin was suggesting?
So I love that you brought this up because it's so simple for us as humans, right, to just say somebody's right or wrong, or we're black and white thinkers so often, and as scientists especially, things are complicated, and the answer is always more complicated than sort of these simple narratives. So yes, one of the things that fascinates me is that these early bipeds from 4, 5, 6 million years ago. Again, we have very little evidence, but what evidence we do have is that they are quite committed to life in the trees, and that when they come down to the ground, yes, they're moving on two legs rather than knuckle walking, but they retain so many of these key adaptations for life in the trees. And so it's almost as though you have, a third of human evolution, right? That first third of human evolution, 4, 5, 6 million years ago, for a long period of time, we are filling this niche of living in a more of a forested habitat, but able to, again, move on two legs occasionally on the ground. They've got their small brains. They don't seem to be reliant on technology, or at least stone tool technology. Okay, so if you're talking about the origins of bipedalism, as Darwin was, and as many of us do, does that coincide with large brains and stone tools? No, it doesn't seem to. However, when you shift into this sort of new stage of bipedal locomotion in Australopithecus, that's Lucy and her kind, where they're much more reliant on travel on the ground. They become excellent upright walkers terrestrially on the ground. What does that seem to coincide with? Yes, a slight increase in brain size. And that's when we start finding stone tools in the record for the first time. And so was Darwin right? Kind of, right?
Yeah.
And I did start by saying, no, he was wrong and blah, blah, but what I was thinking of were those early stages of bipedal locomotion. But if you fast forward now to terrestrial human-like bipedal locomotion in Australopithecus, it does seem to coincide with at least the beginnings of a slight brain increase and stone tool technology and canine reduction. And so for that stage of our evolutionary history, yeah, revisiting Darwin and saying Darwin might have been onto something, I think is fair.
Fascinating. I mean, so is the situation roughly, or could we maybe summarize then the kind of take-home message here as there is a certain way in which Darwin was right in that this kind of like walking on solid ground for most of your time seems to evolve pretty hand in hand with use of stone tools, with smaller teeth, bigger brains. But the question is not, why did a knuckle walking chimpanzee like ancestors decide that they're going to start now being bipedal? Because actually they were being upright bipedals on the trees, the human ancestors before Lucy. And the question was, why did they decide to go to ground from the trees? And why, when they went to the ground, they decided to stay on two legs instead of going down on all fours, as almost all terrestrial mammals do. Is that a rough kind of, is that a good summary of where we are in the quest?
Yes and no. The yes is that I interpret the fossil record and the data we have in that way. Yeah. Many of my really, really intelligent and colleagues would disagree with that. And they think that we will find more evidence for knuckle walking in the past, and that a knuckle walking ancestor continues to be the best model. And then we'd have to reconcile the fact that, an upright walker from a knuckle walker has to pass through this very awkward stage where you're bent hipped, bent kneed, that wastes a lot of energy moving on two legs.
Yeah, it's difficult to kind of get from knuckle walking all the way to upright, because if you look at
I
those
think so.
classic March of Progress images, the middle stages are a bit weird.
Yeah, and moving on two legs really disadvantages us on a dangerous landscape. We are one of the slowest mammals in the world. All sorts of other large-bodied mammals like we are, when they run, when they gallop, they can go 45, 55 miles an hour. And we run at best, Olympic runners run half that speed. So we're really, really slow. We are vulnerable to injury. And when we get injured, I mean, everyone, sprains an ankle or has problems with a knee ligament or collapsed arches of their foot or bunions or lower back problems. And all of that is related to bipedal locomotion.
I love that idea in the book of realizing of how, yes, modernity makes it more likely that we get lower back pain or whatever. But
Sure.
actually, this is really part of the human condition because of bipedalism, because of the upright posture. It puts a lot of strain on everything from knees to ankles to lower back and etc. That really struck with me. That really stuck with me.
Yeah, it sticks with me too. When we find new fossils or look at old fossils in museum collections, and so many of them exhibit the sort of lower back pathologies that are recognized today. So many of them have had sprained ankles, or even they broke their legs, right? So here you are, biped, out on a dangerous landscape, no hospitals, no doctors, not even a house to go in, right? And you break your leg. But the beauty of some of these fossils is that these are healed fractures. And so these individuals survived long enough, at least, to have their injuries healed.
So somebody was taking care of the injured one.
I think that's right. I think that upright walking has to coincide with some degree of prosociality, compassion, empathetic caring of other members of the group. We are a social species. We rely heavily on each other, and I think we always have. And what, to me, the linchpin to all of it is bipedal locomotion. That makes us vulnerable enough that in order to overcome the odds and to overcome all the disadvantages of moving in this way, despite all of the odds of survival for a slow bipedal vulnerable mammal on a dangerous landscape, here we are, right? We had to be hypersocial and caring for one another. Otherwise, I don't think we would have made it.
It's a wonderful implication, not only because it's a beautiful implication, but it's just incredible of how much if we really try, like you and others in your field try, how much can you read from a shin bone?
Right.
You can read a helper on the side carrying an injured friend.
I just when I first discovered paleoanthropology, I was working at a science museum, and I started learning about paleoanthropology because I never took anthropology classes in college or anything like that. I discovered this field after college. And I was reading books by Ian Tattersall and Don Johansson and Mary Leakey, and I was just amazed at the amount of information that they could squeeze out of these fragmentary bones. To me, it was magic. Just, and I thought, I want to learn that. I want to know how we can tell these evidence-based stories, not just about our ancestors in general, but about these individuals, right? Because if you have a fossil in your hand, yes, it represents a species. It represents a time and place that our lineage existed. But it also is the evidence that that individual lived. And our ancestors, they ate and they breathed and they cried and they laughed and they lived and they died just like we do. And so I feel like it's an incredible gift to be able to use the shapes of these bones to tell the stories of the ancestors. And yeah, sometimes the stories are just quite, harrowing stories about individuals who had been hurt and sick. And we could tell that from the bones, which is really, really wonderful.
And I heard you say in a talk, I think it was at Cambridge, that when you look at other creatures on two legs who don't fly like the ostriches, it's almost unheard of to find those examples of healed injuries, because when you are on two legs, you lose one, you're gone if you don't have someone carrying you for weeks sometimes.
That's exactly right. And this is a small project that we haven't published, but we've been trying to collect data on injuries or healed injuries in terrestrial birds, even hopping rodents. And so lots of rodents run around on all fours, but some of them hop.
Well, who hops?
There's something called a kangaroo rat, for instance,
Okay.
and it's called a kangaroo
Okay,
rat.
I gotta check that out.
It's a jerboa that hops around on its two legs.
Okay.
And it turns out that the frequency of healed injuries in the lower leg bones of those animals is a lot lower than the ones that are moving on all fours. Healed injuries in ostriches and emus and cassowaries and rheas, very little data on it, but the data we do have, it's rare, if not unheard of. And again, it's because, like you said, if you're moving on two legs and you lose one of them, you are a goner unless you have individuals taking care of you. And so I think the evidence that we see in the fossil record of these healed injuries is telling us about social behavior in our ancestors as well.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, if we started kind of with this idea of how many things can be interlinked, and you say that, well, the one thing that probably a lot is going to be linked to is the upright posture, walking on two legs. Well, now we have it. It frees our hands for tool use, which then puts brain growth onto the kind of evolutionary premium seat. We have also that changes the diet. With the tools, you don't need canines. We have the fact that we have to go to the physiotherapists all the time.
That's right.
And the fact that despite all our ills, this kind of teamwork, cooperation, carrying your friend's load for a while is almost it's so ordinary for us, unlike many other species, that we don't really celebrate it. We celebrate heroic pro-sociality, but so much of it is so mundane that we almost forget about it. And that all of those things about our species seem to be linked to bipedalism. And then, and as if that wouldn't have been enough, there's also language, right?
Yeah, and language is a fun one because anthropologists debate quite a bit the origins of language and the circumstances under which language evolved, and the whens and the whos and the wheres and the hows and the whys. I interpret the evidence as at least some version of symbolic communication, proto-language was happening already in Homo erectus, in early Homo. I don't think this was something that was unique to later Homo. I think earlier Homo, in order to engage in, say, coordinated hunting of a large mammal, for instance, we find butchered hippo bones and butchered elephant bones in these really old sites. I don't know how you hunt an elephant if you can't talk to other individuals who are doing it with you. And then there's some physical evidence of this in the hyoid bone, aspects of the brain, the throat. Um,
Even Lucy's species had some. This was interesting for me because I was trained, as I mentioned, in psychology,
yeah, yeah.
and so I know very little about the bones, but I do know about Broca's area, which is this small part, and typically in the left hemisphere, which is heavily involved in language. And I think I learned it from your book that either Lucy or some other Australopithecine, that we're able to detect some kind of asymmetry, this kind of left-right asymmetry in that very area. I don't know what that means, but for me that was fascinating because finally it was something I knew about a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't think we know what it means necessarily either, but it's at least been observed in a species of Australopithecus from South Africa, not Lucy species, but Australopithecus sediba has some asymmetry, left-right asymmetry for Broca's area.
So maybe the first step towards language.
Maybe, yeah, yeah, or there's some sort of, gestural communication that's happening, and because, there's some evidence that Broca's area is gonna be active during gestural communication as well. But right, so what does this have to do with bipedalism? Freeing the upper limbs, freeing the torso and the pectoral girdle, so the shoulders and the upper limb from the responsibilities of locomotion. If you free up that whole upper body, those muscles, especially the muscles in the chest and the diaphragm, can be fine-tuned to make those particulate sounds in language. And there are two things to sort of think about when you're trying to connect locomotion and language. And the first is to think about yourself and how difficult it is to actually talk while you're doing physical exertion with your upper body. So if you're carrying a really large box, if you're carrying something really, really heavy, it's hard to talk. So if you're moving with a friend and you're lifting a couch and you're trying to do directions, it's actually quite hard as you're trying to get your voice to do something well. And it's because those muscles are being used for movement, for locomotion. And so that's the first piece. And the second piece is we can look across other animals, and lots of other animals that are known for their communication abilities are again the ones that have sort of freed those upper limbs. So birds, for instance, incredibly vocal, they're bipedal. Um, Not the same way that we are. And of course, they do use their upper limbs for flight, but they're most vocal when they're sitting on a tree branch, not using their upper limbs for anything, right? And then there's an animal called a gelada. It's a monkey that's very, very communicative, and it'll sit and eat seeds, but it sits on its rear, frees up the upper limbs, picks its seeds, and in a social context, there are all these little chirps and garbles that they use to communicate with each other. And then, of course, whales, right? And there's the buoyancy of the water that reduces again and lots of different mechanisms here for communication, right? I'm not saying that these are all running in parallel with each other, but one of the things that seems to unite them is the relaxation of the musculoskeletal forces on the upper limb from locomotion, that's been sort of, taken off their plate. And so now, hey, what else can we use these muscles for? And that's how evolution works so often, right? Is by co-opting structures that were used for something else previously.
Okay, so that's a pretty big suit of things that even if they weren't caused by bipedalism, they were allowed by bipedalism.
Yes. And I think that's the right way to think about it, is that bipedalism lays the foundation for all of these subsequent things that happen in our evolutionary history that we celebrate as being, if not unique, so defining of our lineage. And language is probably the most speculative of them that I present in the book, but many of them that you already mentioned about sociality, dietary diversity, even how we birth and parent our children, these are things that I think are simply not going to happen. They're not even possible unless we evolve bipedalism first.
Well, I want to talk about birth soon because I mean this is one of the best known theories about human bipedalism is that it is the reason why childbirth is so uniquely dangerous for humans. But let's put a pin there, return to it soon. I just want to stay for a moment in this question of, Okay, so bipedalism allows all sorts of really cool and evolutionarily great things to happen, but that can't be the reason it's selected for. I mean, that's not how evolution works. And I know that you would probably say, look, we just don't know, we don't have the full picture. But like, what is your best feeling now? Why did we start walking long distances on two legs? What was the immediate evolutionary reason for
Sure. So it's going to be a very unsatisfying answer. We don't know.
it? Okay.
But some of the hypotheses that I think are most compelling. We are very energetically efficient. We are the Priuses of the animal world. We can move from point A to point B and really not burn many calories at all.
So we're marathon runners, not sprinters.
So yeah. We're very energetically efficient. And so moving on two legs, especially extended limbs seem to be the key here. Which if your listeners, are curious about that, all you have to do is bend your hips and bend your knees and walk around what we call a Groucho walk, like Groucho Marx, that old comedian would bend at the hips and the knees and kind of wobble, and it won't take long before your quads are burning. It's energetically very inefficient to move in that way. Um, of course, the freeing of the hands to carry tools, babies, food. These are all sorts of hypotheses that have been generated over the years. Of course, one of the problems with that is that we don't see evidence of things like tools until later in the fossil record.
But what about carrying infants? There is the fur theory, which is that these are interlinked. Once humans started to travel long distances, maybe because you're foraging across a savanna landscape that doesn't have that many calories per patch, you want to cool down. And if you want to cool down, you lose your fur, you start sweating. Once you lose your fur, your baby cannot be clinging to the fur anymore. You have to carry the baby. You need to you have the arms to carry the baby. So what's your feeling on that theory? I can't remember when I first learned it, but I did when I learned it. I was, oh, that makes perfect sense. Okay, great. Now we know. Apparently it's not so simple. But what do you think about that kind of fur walking because of foraging or something?
And thermoregulation, being able to move on two legs reduces the amount of surface area that's exposed to the sun.
Oh, I
It
see. I see. So there's that additional, yeah.
Yeah, and there's more evaporative cooling that can happen, especially if you're beginning to evolve a higher concentration of sweat glands, along with the reduction of body fur. I love it. I think it characterizes Australopithecus. And so if we're talking about that second stage of bipedal evolution, where you're moving into a savanna environment, the environment is changing, it's not as forested anymore, because a lot of this is being driven by environmental changes.
Yeah, Kristen Hawkes actually talks about that, about the climate changes that.
Yep, in that savanna landscape.
For listeners, by the way, I just want to point out that even if you don't want to listen to the whole Hawkes episode, I actually posted that particular little part of it as a season highlight recently. So if you go back to between season 1 and season 2, there's a couple of season highlights. There's a 7 minutes or something where she explains how she thinks all of this happens. So that's just a little thing to check out. But yeah, please go ahead.
But these explanations, I think, are completely reasonable and supported with the evidence as when we're looking at 4 million years ago, when we're looking at Australopithecus. But the origins of bipedalism precede that.
I see. Okay.
5 million, 6 million, 7 million. And our ancestors at that time, we think, were living in more forested environments. They're up in the trees more. And so those explanations begin to fall apart. And one of the things that I'll note that I find absolutely fascinating, even if it's not as satisfying an answer, is that the early bipeds that we have, I've studied the feet of the feet and the legs, but mostly the feet of these things, and they're all pretty different from each other. They look like they're these experiments in how to be a biped, evolving early in our evolutionary history. And one of the ways to interpret that, in the way that I've thought about it, is maybe in the earliest members of our lineage, bipedalism didn't evolve once. Maybe it evolved a couple of different times, and a couple of different kinds of feet were evolving in different hominins living in different environments. And if that's the case, then they're likely evolving bipedalism for different reasons, right? Depending on the environment where they're living. And so, it's unsatisfying in the sense that there's no one explanation. It's probably a bunch of different explanations depending on the hominin, depending on the time, depending on the place. Now, we need a lot more fossils before I can say that with certainty, but that is how I'm interpreting the ones that we currently have.
I don't want to bore everybody listening too much with going back again into this very technical detail, but just because I do think this matters, so that just to make clear, the first bipeds. When we say biped, we mean two legs upright, but we don't necessarily mean walking on ground. We might mean gibbon style walking mainly on in
Could
the
be.
trees, holding things with your arms. Yeah, so do we have any really good evidence knowing that before Lucy's time, before the Australopithecus, were there these kind of savanna walking, like on the ground walking hominids, or were they all more than style walking kind of in the woods, in the trees? Because for me, that looks like that's a really big difference. And it's all kind of veiled under this one term of bipedalism. But
Sure.
But if we try to understand what drives what, if everybody before Australopithecus were living mainly in trees, then it kind of would, I think all of these classical theories would make a lot of sense. Okay, now when the forests go away and they move to the savanna, okay, they don't get up from their knuckles, they stay on their 2 feet. Then all of this cascade that we're talking about is unraveling. So do we have any really good evidence about where were the early bipeds walking, in trees or on the ground or both?
It's a great question. The 3 fossils that we have from that time period that you're talking about, Ardipithecus, Aurorantuganensis, and Sahelanthropus. Ardipithecus has aspects of its pelvis and its foot that would indicate that it could move on the ground on 2 legs. But its fingers and its hands and its big toe, its grasping big toe, and parts of the pelvis would indicate that it's also an outstanding tree climber and probably spent most of its time in the trees. So could it move bipedally in the trees, hand-assisted bipedalism? Sure. But some of the anatomies of the foot and the pelvis, to me at least, are good indicators that when it did come down to the ground to move from food patch to food patch, it would have traveled on 2 legs. And so I wouldn't describe that time period as gibbon-like bipedalism. I think there are adaptations for more human-like terrestrial bipedalism, but not like what you see in Lucy and her kind yet.
So most of the time on gibbon style, but sometimes human style. Okay.
So yeah, exactly.
Okay. And that was one of the 3?
Yeah, that's one of the 3. And then I think the others kind of exist on each side of that argument, where the femur from Auroran, and again, all we have from the lower limb is a part of a femur, and it looks like it's from a really, really good biped. It looks like it's from something that can move on 2 legs quite efficiently. Now, I would like to see the foot. I'd like to see the pelvis before I'm confident in how the animal moved. We don't have those yet. Again, it looks like, from its arms and its fingers, it looks like it's really comfortable in the trees, but that femur, that leg bone, is, to me, really good evidence that it could at least occasionally travel on the ground on its 2 legs. The one that is causing the most controversy, and that really has for since its discovery in 2002, or its announcement in 2002, is a fossil called Sahelanthropus chadensis, from Chad, the country of Chad, and purported to be the earliest hominin. There's a fragmentary femur and some arm bones that were just published. And some researchers interpret it as being a human-like upright walker, descending from something that's moving on 2 legs in the trees, like what we were describing. And there's another team that just published a paper uh, uh, based on the arm bones that this thing probably was knuckle walking. And so the bones are pretty fragmentary. And when you only have a couple of fossils, and you only look at a couple of features, there's quite a bit of disagreement right now in the field. And so it's key that those fossils become available for any researchers to look at so we can really try to figure this out.
Okay. Okay. But we do have to return then to the question of childbirth, because this is really a huge topic. The classic childbirth dilemma being this idea that at the same time that if Darwin was even broadly correct in that there is any link between bipedalism and brain growth, well, that's a huge problem for childbirth because larger brains may, and at the same time, pelvic structure changing due to walking to be worse for giving birth. Brain is making the head bigger, which again makes birth more difficult. And hence we get this tragic situation, which, well, the Bible tries to explain one way, and then the human evolution explains another way in terms of why is it so lethal for our species to give birth. So what's yeah, I don't know where to start because there's a lot there. What's your yeah? Go ahead. What do you think about this?
It is hard to know where to start because of all the different factors that are sort of interlocking in thinking of this kind of explanation. One of the places to start is an idea that was proposed in the 1960s by a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, named Sherwood Washburn. He proposed something called the obstetrical dilemma. And he argued that because of bipedalism, there are changes to the pelvis, and that is 100% correct. We absolutely see changes in the pelvis. Lucy's pelvis, for instance, is very, very different from, say, chimpanzees. So the pelvis is a key anatomy for muscle attachments that are important for upright walking. But the changes in the bony pelvis also necessarily constrict some of the dimensions of the birth canal. And what Sherwood Washburn then said was, therefore, humans give birth prematurely. We give birth to babies earlier than they're ready to be born. They are, because of that, what we call altricial. Altricial comes from terminology on bird species and other mammals either being hairless and helpless versus those that are born and can get right up and start moving.
Humans are pretty helpless.
Yeah, pretty helpless. That's right. So our helpless babies. And not only that, but further work, researchers argued that it also explains why women are compromised in their bipedal abilities compared to men. Okay. So again, testable ideas. So my colleague Holly Dunsworth at the University of Rhode Island has looked at that question of whether humans are born earlier than expected, and we're not. Our gestation lengths are actually quite long for a primate of our size. They're 40 weeks, almost about 10 months, whereas chimpanzees are 8.5 months. So we don't give birth prematurely. Our babies are helpless, but it's not because they're being born earlier than expected. And other researchers, Anna Warner, for instance, who's at the University of Colorado, Denver, she's tested this hypothesis that wider hips leads to more energetic inefficiency during walking, and that's not the case either. And so women are not compromised in their locomotion, which makes sense evolutionarily, that women and their offspring are sort of the key to evolutionary success of a species. It's a horrible idea for evolutionarily, again, for there to be compromised locomotion.
And by the way, I mean, the finding is really important because it apparently was a kind of just a textbook thing that, quote unquote, everybody knew that women were supposed to be worse walkers. Well, now we know that that's based on, that was based basically on nothing. But how does it relate to this childbirth dilemma exactly?
Right. And yet, compared to, say, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and our ape cousins, there is a much, much tighter fit between the size of the baby and the size of the birth canal in humans. It, as you mentioned earlier, can have tragic consequences. Women can die in childbirth, or there can be subsequent hemorrhaging and infection. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, this seems like something that needs to be examined and thought about. And researchers continue to do so. One of the possible explanations for why Why not just make the birth canal larger, right? If it's not compromising locomotion.
Also, that's the link to the theory was that wider hips are making women bad
Yeah,
walkers. Well, now we
that's
know
right.
they're not, so they could have just been growing them more.
So why not just right? And a lot of work now is suggesting that a larger side to side medial dimension of the pelvic outlet um, would increase pelvic prolapse. And pelvic prolapse would be is a debilitating condition for some women, where the reproductive organs, because of the pull of gravity, again because we're bipedal, is going to pull those organs externally, right? And that can lead to infection, all sorts of problems. So, okay, how do we solve this problem, right? And we solve it. We solve it culturally. We solve it through our technology. Um, but one of the things that I think is fascinating when you think about childbirth are the mechanics of childbirth in humans compared to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, their labor is quite short; it's about 40 minutes, and their babies in utero are facing their heads are facing down and facing forward, and then the babies don't change direction most of the time. There's some evidence that they'll occasionally turn, but most births have shown that they are born facing forward, and the mothers can reach down and assist with their own births, and then bring the baby up and nurse right away. That's not how most births happen in humans. Again, because of bipedalism and the changes to the shape of the pelvis, what happens is our babies start the same way, down, their heads facing down and forward. Um, and then as they enter the birth canal, they have to corkscrew through the birth canal, and they end up being born 95% of births. The babies are born back of the head facing forward. So they've rotated. So now their faces are facing backwards. And if a woman reached down like a chimpanzee would and assisted with her own birth, they could exert a torque on the neck of the baby and actually injure the baby. And so what happens when women give birth is that they give birth and this is cross culturally, they give birth in a social context usually with experienced women or midwives present, and assisting with the delivery. So how far back does this go? Well, we have a pelvis from Lucy, a beautiful, beautiful pelvis of Lucy, and we can estimate the size of the baby's head. We can model it after a chimpanzee's head, but of course their heads were a little bigger than a chimpanzee, so I think we're being conservative there. But even then, if you try to birth a chimpanzee baby through the birth canal of Lucy, it only goes through if you corkscrew, if you twist that baby through, and then it can be born.
So Lucy couldn't give birth alone.
Yes, that this is the connection again between these old bones and behavior and thinking about how they interacted with each other socially. That because of bipedalism, the birth mechanics changed in early hominins such that babies had to rotate through the birth canal. That rotation made birth more challenging, and more successful outcomes could be achieved if assisted birth was part of the behavioral repertoire of our ancestors. So midwifery is the oldest human profession, goes all the way back at least 3.5 million years ago. So it's another one of these really, really wonderful examples of the intersection between something as mundane as locomotion, just how you get from point A to point B, but also social behavior of our ancestors just helping each other out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, would it be, now not being Darwin's advocate, but Washburn's advocate,
Mm.
would it then again kind of be right to say that, well, painting with a broad brush, he's right, that it's bipedalism and a large brain do make births more difficult in humans. Now, it happens with that the details are not quite as they were thought to be. It's not quite that the gestation is shorter. No, it's not shorter. It's actually longer. But the babies are helpless, very helpless, more helpless than in other primates when they come out. So there's a seed of truth. Okay. There's a technical difference, but the broad idea is pretty correct. okay, the reason the pelvis couldn't be made larger is not because women will be even worse walkers. No, they're not bad walkers to begin with, but there are other reasons. So the basic kind of summary of this dilemma still holds, that bipedalism and large brains are the main reasons why human birth is so difficult. And then there is the beautiful side to that, which is also why it bonds us together and makes us be such a social species.
Yeah.
But would you say that that's still, that's kind of rough, still the picture we have?
I think you phrase it well. Some of my colleagues will say there is no obstetrical dilemma, and others will come back and say yes, there is. And ultimately, the disagreement comes down to whether you're taking Washburn at his exact words, or whether you're going to interpret Washburn sort of more broadly. So it's exactly as you describe, that if you, I think that if you interpret Washburn exactly as he wrote it, then yeah, the obstetrical dilemma is absolutely not what he describes. Those details are incorrect. They've been tested now, and we know that's not the case. And yet, the way the obstetrical dilemma has been interpreted by the field in general has been that there has been some trade-off, right, between bipedalism and brain enlargement, and what? Well, is it the efficiency of locomotion? No, it's not that. But might it have something to do with pelvic prolapse? Perhaps. Might it have something to do with the difficulties in childbirth? Perhaps. And do we have a social and cultural response to that? Yeah, we sure do. And that's quite ancient. But where my colleagues, I think it's important to point out, where my colleagues, I think, have contributed considerably to this discussion is in the obstetrical literature, really challenging this idea that women's bodies are compromised, right? And so the medicalization of childbirth and this idea that women's bodies are sort of compromised by evolution is enormously problematic. And it really does go back to some of the ideas that maybe Washburn unwittingly started in talking about this obstetrical dilemma. And so there's I think a lot has been gained in the last
In the criticism, yeah.
as we should take these old ideas, whether they're from Darwin or Washburn or others, and continually interrogate them with new evidence and new ideas.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you've done a great job at helping us get a glimpse into what that looks like. I mean, it's really striking, even if some of the details would end up being a bit different than what we've discussed. It still is just striking that we have talked about so many aspects of a kind of basic human condition, that like the kind of like that really cuts through what culture you're born into, what age you're born into. Well, you're gonna have an upright posture, even if you're not walking. You're gonna be having this skeletal structure, which then is linked to everything from our capacity to speak, from our capacity to use tools and therefore technology, even our teeth, our common ailments from our ankles to our back pain.
Yeah.
Actually, we didn't mention this earlier, but I learned from your book that even the fact that our sinuses get so blocked all the time
Yes.
is linked to upright posture. And then on the beautiful side, the fact that because this puts so much strain on everything from childbirth to straight ankles, this is one of the reasons why we couldn't be here alone.
Absolutely. Yep. Well said.
So that's a beautiful journey. Before we finish, I have a couple of questions I did want to touch upon. One is shoes. I couldn't believe it. I never had thought about shoes before as something that, I mean, I thought of Nikes when I thought about shoes, and as something super modern. Of course, what is natural for humans is to walk barefoot. And it never occurred to me to think that, well, hold on, how do you get to Siberian tundras if you're barefoot?
That's right.
So, how old is shoe use?
Yeah. So the oldest physical evidence for shoes in the form of the materials for footwear are about 10,000 years old. But the oldest evidence we have that shoes were being worn goes back about 30,000 years. Wearing shoes reduces the forces that are on your toe bones, And so as you're growing as a kid, if those forces are reduced, then the bones are not going to grow as thick, as robust. And the reduction in the size or the thickness of those toe bones we can first detect in fossils from Russia that are about 30,000 years old. There's a site in China as well that's quite similar in age and has that same kind of anatomy of that.
And so, just to be clear, this is something that it's the shoes are so much part of their lifestyle that we can see it in their bones, but it's not a genetic adaptation to a shoe wearing culture. It's something that happens within development. Is that right?
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Bone is such plastic material that certain aspects of it, like its robusticity or how thin or gracile a bone ends up being, is often a result of what you're doing with it when you're a kid. Yeah.
Well, what about then the question of like my, as I kind of hinted earlier, I had this naive view that of course it's completely unnatural for humans to wear shoes while we wear shoes in the modern world. But isn't there still something, ergonomically speaking, if we think about health? I mean, there's this idea of barefoot walking is the best for our spine or whatever. How true is that? I mean, I don't see a one-to-one correspondence with what we're talking about in terms of old Siberian people and,
Sure.
and, and
Sure.
modern health, but this idea that humans have been using shoes since, well, not since Lucy's time, but since the Ice Ages, it puts a question mark into this idea. Well, is it a completely unnatural thing? Is our spine really not used to it? If that's actually one of the secrets to us being able to spread around the world. So what do you know about that? Just like speaking purely as a modern human interested in my health and those famous
Yeah.
ailments that our bipedalism puts
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway away. Is our shoes making it worse? And if they are, then what should we do about it?
Yeah. I get this question a lot from students, especially runners, and they want to go to a minimalist shoe or eventually go to barefoot. And usually my advice for them is that if they're perfectly fine, if they're not ever injured, if they're not having shin splints, if they're not having knee problems, if they're not having arch problems, if their plantar fasciitis is not inflamed, don't change anything. That yes, you are a product of a long evolutionary history, and for 99.9% of it, probably 99.5% of it, yes, your ancestors were not wearing shoes, but your body is also the product of a developmental history where you yourself as an individual were born, and those bones, yes, they carry with them some echoes of the past, but they're also plastic material that can be altered by what you do as an individual. So if you've been wearing shoes your whole life and your bones grew in that environment and your muscles attached in that environment and your ligaments thickened and anchored in that environment, and then suddenly you change that environment, you have now put your musculoskeletal system into a completely new place that it has to adapt. And sometimes that means pain,
I see. Very interesting.
and potential injury. So I did this myself. I like to run, and my colleague at Harvard, Dan Lieberman, has done some really great work on barefoot locomotion, especially running, and has shown that the mechanics of running change when you move barefoot, and those mechanics can be beneficial overall to musculoskeletal health. And the data are really strong on this. But what he said to me when I said, well, I'm going to, go to a minimalist shoe, he said, do it slowly, do it gradually, adjust your body to this. And of course, I'm an impatient person, so I didn't. And I immediately had calf problems. And and the mechanics of it completely make sense that if you heel strike, you get shin splints. If you're up on your toes, you get calf problems. And so there's always a trade-off. So that's my feeling on sort of the barefoot movement is, yes, absolutely. Throughout our evolutionary history, we were barefoot, but were you as an individual your whole life? Because if not, do it carefully, do it slowly, let your body adapt, let your body adjust to this new thing that you're proposing that it should do. It's not gonna bodies don't work like suddenly, oh, yes, now you put me in my true evolutionary state.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's just not how they, unless you're having extreme pain, you do have shin splints, you do have knee problems, you do have plantar fasciitis. And so, yeah, something should change,
Okay, and then it might be the solution. Yeah.
and then it might be the solution. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So perhaps yes, but slowly towards them, accepting there's pain
Yeah,
and then more
which
than
is
immediate.
usually the advice that is,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, good to follow.
Well, no, that's also a great reminder of how we are not quite set in stone by our genes.
Correct. Correct, exactly. I mean, the nature nurture, uh, sort of, argument that of course it's not a nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture. They're interconnected, in really this sort of beautiful dance. And the musculoskeletal system is a great place to see it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What about walking and the benefits of walking? Your book has a really nice, I don't remember if it's a chapter or several chapters actually on how wonderful walking can be for us. And I had a question about it because the benefits and this is something deeply practical for all of us. I mean, there's just studies after studies showing that everything from some types of cancer to heart and brain health, Alzheimer's, so many health conditions can be prevented to some extent, or the risk reduced or mitigated while you have them with something as little as, I remember there was a study on Alzheimer's where the duction in hippocampus, which is often associated with Alzheimer, was not only slowed down but actually the direction was changed. These people's hippocampus was actually increased in the size by walking. I think it was 40 minutes 3 times a week. That's not that much to ask.
It's not much to ask at all.
And that's fascinating.
It really was. When I dove into this book, I'm a paleoanthropologist. I study fossils, and so that whole first half of the book, um, this was a world that I knew really well and could write about. Um, and so the second half of the book, where I'm sort of going into what does this have to do with you today, right? And how do kids learn how to walk? And that's where I get into sort of the issues of childbirth as well. And then, right, these physiological data and studies that show that walking has you know, just tremendous medical benefits to individuals. I had no idea. Of course, sort of, intuitively, yeah. You're struggling with something, an idea, a problem. You go for a walk, and you come back, and hey, okay, now you're thinking more clearly. But I didn't know anything about the mechanism, and so my background was in physiology. And when I got my degree in 1998, the word myokines had never even been sort of used in the literature.
In my life, it was never used before I read the book.
Right, right.
Myokines.
Myokine. These are molecules produced by muscle tissue, and it turns out that muscle is an endocrine organ.
The hormone producing organ.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so as you use your muscles, as you physically exercise, and it can be something as simple as a walk, your muscles are putting these myokines in your bloodstream. And there are over 100 different kinds of them that have been identified. There are probably many, many more that haven't been found yet. And they target specific tissues around your body, and can do things as you said. They can ward off cancers and diabetes. Stroke risk reduces with a walk, but they also can target regions of the brain, and increase creativity. They can target regions of the brain like the hippocampus, and improve memory. I was just I was stunned by the literature that's out there right now on the benefits of walking. And wow, I mean, what a simple way to keep yourself healthy too,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly.
Just take a walk.
Is there anybody in the world who has too many myokines? Like, do they have a downside?
I don't. That's a great question. I have no idea. I have no idea. If, like ultra marathoners,
Yeah,
have
yeah, but basically, no. The short answer is that they are a pretty good thing all around.
it appears that way. It appears that way, and they've even been shown in uh, folks that are in wheelchairs. and do sort of wheelchair activities, whether it's sort of, a sport like like basketball game or even just going down the streets, that myokines is still produced.
That's okay. So, because I was going to ask about that was my question was, is it something special about walking or is it
No.
just like, look, even walking as a sport?
Yeah.
It's enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Even anything that's going to activate your muscles. And yet, so having said that, though, there's this really brilliant study done at Stanford looking at creativity and walking, and they had individuals who were on a treadmill, and they did some measure of creativity afterwards. So they were walking, and then other individuals who were walking outside, and there's a difference. And so I say, yes, it's just the act of moving your muscles and those myokines, yes, but there's a psychology to this too, that if you're taking your walk, in a stimulating environment, if you're not just staring at a blank wall, but you're looking at sort of, trees and flowing streams, that has a positive benefit. And the mechanism of that is unclear, but it appears that taking a walk outside and in nature, does have more benefits than on a busy road or on a
At
treadmill.
least for psychologically,
Correct.
were there any studies about the kind of Alzheimer's or bone health or anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that
Okay.
I'm aware of,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. You said that if you had a time machine, you would go and see Lucy.
I would. I would.
What do you think you would find, or what would be the biggest questions in your mind on?
Geez, I'd want to spend a day with her. I mean, I'm interested in locomotion, so I would want to know, uh, am I right? Does she spend most of her time on the ground and then only at night? Or if she's feels like there's some danger, does she flee into the trees? Oh, I'd be so curious how they handle their babies. Do they give them to one another to care for? Do they, so that's what's called cooperative parenting. And there are multiple members of the group that care for the infants, because in chimpanzees, it's just mom. She will not hand that baby off to anyone else. But in humans, we're so attracted to babies, and we'll hand them off to people as we do our errands and do our things. Are they living their life like that? I'd be really, really curious the group size. How do they avoid predation because they're so slow? How do they avoid just getting picked off by leopard?
Yeah, what do you think? Because that seems to be the big problem in leaving the trees is that you have the big cats waiting for you. So what do you do? Are they throwing rocks?
So I think they probably are, yeah. And waving sticks, and the leopard doesn't wanna bother with them if they're gonna be mobbed, if they do approach them. But that's only gonna work if they're moving in a large group, and they're hyper vigilant, lots of eyes on the horizon.
I guess bipedalism helps a little bit. When you're
Yeah,
upright, you
sure,
see more.
sure. And then activity patterns, I would expect that they would be much more active in the daytime, when the big cats are asleep. And then, dusk and dawn, they retreat back into the trees to get away from the big cats. That would be my expectation.
And
Yeah,
so when somebody sprays an ankle, they are literally carried up to the tree.
they would need to be. They would need to be. Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
That's friendship.
right. Oh, friendships. Yeah. Do they only affiliate with relatives, or do they have friends? And I bet they have friends. Communication style. How do they? There's no evidence they could talk to each other. But how are they communicating? Is it more like a chimpanzee does, or is there something more sophisticated? How often are they making tools? Is that part of their daily routine? The questions after question after question. I
Uh,
would absolutely love a day with Lucy. Yeah,
well, we can't really get you there, but the bones have gotten you incredibly close to some of those answers. It's really incredible, as you say, how much you can squeeze from a little bone.
yeah. They are the best thing we have to time machines. Yep.
Okay, well, before we finish, one final question. During all of this using the bones as a time machine and other works around human evolution, what has changed most in your outlook on humanity?
Oh, that's a really great question. So what we see in the fossil record are these really amazing ancestors of ours, well adapted for their environments, clever, often technologically savvy, sometimes symbolic even, um, and they're gone. They've gone extinct. Um, and here we are, and we as scientists or we as people, I think, have often made the argument that there's something exceptional about us, and that we're different from these other ancestors, and that's why we're here and why they're gone. And I don't see it. Yeah, we're extraordinary. There is no doubt, but I see us more as as a as a as an accumulation of a lot of those other behavioral, cultural, and biological adaptations that evolved in things that were not us, that were ancestors of ours and extinct relatives of ours. And so what I see in the fossil record is evidence of remarkable, yes, resilience and grit in our ancestors that allowed us to still be here, but also extraordinary serendipity, and that it could have been Neanderthals and not us. It could have been Homo floresiensis or Homo naledi, and Homo sapiens could have gone extinct 75,000 years ago. Um, there's no really good reason, I think, that I can see in the fossil record or in the cultural record, why we would survive and the others wouldn't. I think there's a lot of luck here and a lot of extinction in our ancestors. And so I think we approach our place in the world sometimes with some real arrogance and hubris that is undeserved and, in fact, dangerous. That we have always been a vulnerable primate on this planet. Our lineage has always been vulnerable to extinction, and we see extinction through the fossil record. And I don't think things are any different now than they were. Certainly in some ways, but I think our vulnerability remains. And I think more than ever, some of the changes that we are implementing on this planet are rendering us more and more vulnerable. And I'm worried about that. And I think some of and people should be worried about that. And I think this paleontological perspective that I get to have as a scientist doing what I do, where what do I see when there's climate change happening throughout time? Because there is. The climate has changed throughout time. But what is that? What accompanies that? Extinction. And so, yeah, that's what I've learned from the fossils and the work that I do is that we were really lucky to be here, and we shouldn't interpret that as any sort of privileged position where we can do whatever we want.
Professor Jeremy DeSilva, thank you so much for your work and the generous time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you.